At 11:32 a.m. on November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran was crouched in the tail of a B-17 flying fortress called Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, staring out into a sky that suddenly felt far too small. German fighters were rushing toward his bomber in groups, fast and angry, closing the distance like predators that had already decided who would die first. Moran was only 19. A farm kid from Wisconsin. And this was his first real combat mission. That morning, the 8th Air Force had launched a massive strike, more than 300 bombers sent to hit Bremen, a major industrial center that kept Germany's war machine running. Factories, shipyards, aircraft production, submarine facilities, Bremen was loaded with targets, and it was defended like a fortress. The crews knew the odds were bad, but they also knew the mission wouldn't wait. Before the first hour was even over, German defenses had already destroyed multiple flying fortresses. Bombers that had taken off with full crews were now falling as burning wreckage, disappearing into the clouds below. Eugene Moran's position on the aircraft was the most isolated place a man could sit in a warplane. The tail gunner was stationed at the very back, separated from the rest of the crew by a long stretch of fuselage. No one could reach him quickly. No one could see what he was seeing. And if something went wrong back there, he would face it alone. His world was narrow and brutal, a cramped compartment, an oxygen mask, freezing air, and 2.50 caliber machine guns. That was his entire defense against the enemy fighters hunting them. The B-17 carried 10 men. Pilot and co-pilot up front. Navigator and bombardier in the nose. A flight engineer working the top turret. A radio operator positioned behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners firing from open side windows. A ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a glass sphere. And Moran, alone in the tail, guarding the most dangerous angle of attack. German pilots had learned early in the war that attacking a B-17 from behind was the cleanest way to kill it. From that direction, only one crewman had a clear shot back, the tail gunner. So they aimed for him first, trying to silence the rear guns before tearing into the bomber's engines and body. By late 1943, the American bomber campaign over Germany was bleeding crews at an almost unbelievable rate. Deep missions were considered nightmares, long hours over hostile territory, surrounded by flak and fighters, where the sky itself seemed to be designed to destroy you. Crews had to complete 25 missions to earn a trip home, but statistics showed most didn't survive that long. Many crews didn't even reach 15. Moran had enlisted as soon as he turned 18. He grew up near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, working on a dairy farm and watching planes pass overhead, dreaming of being part of that world. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, and young men from rural towns were often perfect for the job. They were used to hard work, cold mornings, and steady hands. Many already knew how to shoot. Training taught Moran how to track fast targets, how to lead his fire, and how to fire in controlled bursts so the barrels wouldn't overheat. He memorized the shapes of enemy aircraft until he could identify them instantly: Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, long before they reached firing range. But nothing in training could prepare him for the reality of combat over Germany. At 24,000 feet, the cold was savage. Temperatures could drop to 40 below zero. Frostbite wasn't a possibility, it was a constant threat. The thin air made every movement feel heavier. Even with heated gear, the cold seeped into bones and joints. Breath turned to ice on oxygen masks. And the enemy fighters arrived in waves, armed with cannons that could rip through aluminum like it was paper. That morning, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi had taken off from Snetterton Heath in England as part of the 96th Bomb Group. The bomber formations crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each aircraft positioned so their guns could overlap and create a wall of fire. The plan was simple: stay close enough that enemy fighters couldn't isolate one bomber without risking heavy return fire. In reality, the formations were vulnerable in a different way. A flak burst that hit one aircraft could damage another flying nearby. A bomber that exploded could scatter debris into the formation. And during the bomb run, there was no dodging. Bombers had to fly straight and level to hit their target, which meant they were forced to stay predictable at the worst possible moment. As they approached Bremen, anti-aircraft fire erupted around them. Black bursts of flak filled the sky like dark flowers opening and closing in violent flashes. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. Moran watched a bomber ahead of them take a direct hit. It didn't just drop. It seemed to fold, break apart, and vanish downward in a trail of smoke and fire. Then the bomb bay doors opened. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi released its load, thousands of pounds of explosives falling toward the factories below. The mission objective was complete. Now came the part that killed crews, getting out. The formation began turning back toward England. They still had miles of hostile airspace to cross, and the danger wasn't over. If anything, it was about to get worse. As they turned, flak found them again. A direct hit struck the No. 2 engine. The propeller began to spin uselessly, and the bomber started losing speed. It was the kind of damage that didn't always look dramatic at first, but every man on board knew what it meant. A bomber that fell behind the formation became a target. A lone B-17 without the protection of the group's combined firepower was a gift to German fighter pilots. They watched for stragglers, and when they saw one, they moved in like hunters surrounding an injured animal. Moran saw them coming. Messerschmitts climbed from below. Focke-Wulfs dove from above. Their aircraft was about to face an attack it couldn't outrun, and Moran, alone in the tail, was about to take the first blow. The initial assault came from low and behind, the classic approach that gave attackers a clear shot at the tail. Moran pressed his back against the armor plate behind him and squeezed both triggers. The twin .50 caliber machine guns came alive, roaring so loud it felt like the sound lived inside his skull. Tracer rounds cut bright lines through the air. The first German fighter broke away, forced to pull off before it flew straight into his fire. But there were more. Many more. The German pilots attacked in pairs, working like professionals. One would distract the gunner, drawing fire, while the second slipped into position for a deadly shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target, trying to stay ahead of them. Spent brass casings piled around his knees. The air in the compartment filled with the sharp smell of burned powder. Outside, the temperature was far below zero. Inside the bomber, it wasn't much better. Moran wore heated gear, but the cold still found its way in. His fingers began to numb inside his gloves even as the gun barrels grew hot from constant firing. His breath left ice crystals on the rubber of his oxygen mask. The Luftwaffe pilots knew exactly how to kill a flying fortress. First, damage the engines. A bomber that couldn't keep up was doomed. Then, eliminate the gunners to remove the defensive fire. After that, pour cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital broke. Moran heard impacts before he understood them. The sound of heavy rounds punching through metal. The tearing, grinding scream of aluminum being ripped open. Somewhere forward, firing stopped from one of the waist positions. Then the other. The intercom crackled with static and broken voices, but he couldn't tell who was speaking or what they were saying. The bomber shook as more hits landed. Moran kept firing because there was nothing else he could do. A Focke-Wulf came in from the side. Moran tracked it, squeezed the triggers, and watched the fighter's wing break apart. It spiraled downward, trailing smoke. His first confirmed kill. There was no time to celebrate. Cannon rounds slammed into the tail. Moran felt a brutal impact on his left forearm. Then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked into his sleeves. The pain was immediate, sharp enough to make his vision flash, but his hands still worked. He could still hold the triggers. He could still shoot. Above him, the tail structure took more hits. Control cables snapped and whipped violently. The entire tail section began to vibrate like it was coming apart. Something was terribly wrong with the aircraft, and Moran could feel it. He glanced down at his parachute pack, strapped to his chest. Every airman wore one. If the bomber went down, it was supposed to be their last chance. But when Moran looked closer, his stomach dropped. The parachute had been shredded. Holes ripped through the fabric. It was ruined. Useless. If he had to bail out, he wouldn't float. He would fall 4 miles to his death. The attacks continued. Fighters made pass after pass. Moran counted at least 15 circling the crippled bomber. The aircraft was losing altitude and speed. The remaining engine strained, but it wasn't enough. Forward in the nose section, the navigator, Jesse Orizon, was still alive. He was wounded but conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were dead at the controls. The flight engineer was dead. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Out of the 10 men who took off from England that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orizon in the front. Moran in the tail. And between them, a long stretch of shattered aircraft filled with smoke, holes, and death. Then another hit landed, one that struck something critical. Moran felt the bomber lurch. A grinding vibration ran through the airframe. It intensified until it felt like the aircraft was shaking itself apart. Then came a sound he would never forget, the scream of metal tearing, the shriek of a structure failing. The bomber was breaking. The fuselage split just forward of the tail. Moran watched the front section separate and fall away. Wings, engines, cockpit, everything, tumbling down toward the German countryside far below. The bodies of his crew, the aircraft's heart and power, all of it dropping away into the void. And Moran? He was still inside the tail section. Alive. Wounded. Parachute destroyed. Falling from 24,000 feet over enemy territory. The tail section began to tumble through the sky, spinning end over end. Moran was thrown against the walls. His injured arms screamed with pain. Blood sprayed across the inside of the compartment. Wind howled through the torn opening where the rest of the bomber had been. He should have been frozen with fear. He should have curled up and waited for the end. Instead, he did something that didn't make sense. He kept fighting. The German fighters were still circling. They saw the tail section falling and moved closer, perhaps to confirm the kill, perhaps out of curiosity. Whatever the reason, they made a mistake. They flew within range of a tail gunner who refused to stop. Moran grabbed the guns again. The spinning wreck made aiming almost impossible. G-forces slammed him down, then threw him upward. His arms were bleeding, his parachute was gone, the ground was rushing up, and still he fired. Tracers streaked wildly through the air as the tail rotated. The German pilots scattered, shocked by the sight. A man trapped in a falling piece of bomber wreckage, shooting back at them like the fight wasn't over. One fighter took hits and broke away trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail section was damaged, but Moran could see the earth growing closer through gaps in the torn metal. Fields and forests formed a patchwork beneath him. Roads cut thin lines across the landscape. The ground was getting bigger fast. Then something unexpected happened. The tail section stabilizers began catching air. They created drag, slowing the descent. The spinning started to reduce. The wreckage didn't drop straight down anymore. It began to glide, crude and unstable, but gliding. It wasn't safe. It wasn't controlled. But it was slower than a human body in freefall. That small difference gave him time. Time measured in seconds, but seconds that mattered. Moran used every one of them to keep firing at any fighter that came close. The ground rushed up. 5,000 feet. 3,000. 1,000. Moran braced himself against the armor plate, and wrapped his arms around the ammunition boxes because there was nothing else to hold on to. The tail section slammed into the top of a pine tree at high speed. Branches snapped violently. Metal tore. The stabilizer caught and ripped away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding pieces with each impact. Moran's head struck the metal framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt ribs crack. His arms bent in ways arms were never meant to bend. Then the wreckage hit the frozen ground. Silence. Eugene Moran was alive. Barely. He lay trapped in twisted metal, unable to move. Both forearms were shattered with compound fractures. His ribs were broken. A head wound had torn part of his skull, leaving brain tissue exposed to the freezing air. Every breath felt like a knife. The crash site was in a forest near a German town south of Bremen. Enemy territory. And the people who would arrive first weren't rescuers. They were German soldiers. Moran tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were useless. Cold crept deeper into his body. Hypothermia could kill him within hours if the bleeding didn't finish him first. He dragged himself toward the opening where the tail had separated. Every movement sent waves of pain through his broken body. He pulled himself onto the frozen ground and looked up at the gray sky. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute. One of only a handful of men in the entire war who would do something like that. But survival didn't mean safety. Voices echoed through the trees. German voices. Soldiers approaching. They emerged with rifles raised, surrounding the wreckage and staring at the American in the snow. Orders were shouted. One man ran back toward the road, likely to call for an officer. Moran couldn't resist. He couldn't fight. He could barely breathe. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his cries as they moved his broken arms. They found his dog tags, his rank, his ruined parachute. Then they left him lying in the cold while they examined the wreckage. An officer arrived within an hour. He looked at Moran's injuries and shook his head. The American was clearly dying. Moving him anywhere seemed pointless, but rules were rules. Downed airmen were to be captured and questioned if possible. Dead men provided no intelligence. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blankets, no medical care. The cart bounced over frozen roads for what felt like forever. Every jolt sent fresh agony through his ribs and arms. The head wound had slowed its bleeding only because the cold was freezing the blood into a dark crust. Eventually, the cart delivered him to a German military facility. Moran couldn't tell what kind. His vision blurred. Consciousness came in waves. He remembered being carried inside. He remembered a concrete floor. He remembered German voices speaking about him like he was already a corpse. No doctor came. No medic. No water. No bandages. No pain relief. He lay there for 2 days. Infection spread. His arms darkened. His wounds worsened. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, he would die. On the 3rd day, they moved him again. Another cart. Another miserable journey. This time he arrived at a prisoner of war hospital, an improvised place where wounded Allied airmen were kept until they recovered enough to be transferred to permanent camps. The hospital was overwhelmed and short on supplies. Doctors had to decide quickly who was worth treating. Those who could be saved received care. Those who looked hopeless were left to die. Moran looked hopeless. But among the staff were 2 Serbian doctors, prisoners forced to work there. They had been captured on the Eastern Front, and were now performing surgeries with poor tools, limited supplies, and almost no anesthesia. The Germans allowed it because it freed their own doctors to treat German casualties. The Serbian doctors examined Moran and made a decision. They would try to save him. Not because they were ordered. Not because they had everything they needed. But because a dying man was in front of them, and they were physicians. The operation lasted 7 hours. They worked with crude instruments. They used what anesthesia they could, but it barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they reset shattered bones with metal pins and wire. They removed infected tissue. They cleaned wounds that had been rotting for days. They removed fragments from his skull and covered exposed brain as best they could. They attached a metal plate to his head. Rough by modern standards, but enough to keep him alive. They splinted his arms with wooden boards. Wrapped them in bandages torn from whatever fabric they could find. When the surgery ended, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. If infection spread, he would die. If his body held on, he might live. That night the fever came. Moran's temperature climbed dangerously high. His body shook with violent chills even as sweat poured off him. The Serbian doctors stayed close, changing bandages and forcing water between his cracked lips. Antibiotics existed, but in a German POW facility they were nearly impossible to obtain. Infection killed more wounded men than bullets did. Moran's body was now fighting a war inside itself. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He called for his mother. He shouted warnings to crewmates who were already gone. His mind replayed the bomber breaking apart again and again, trapped in a loop of terror. The doctors had no miracle medicine to offer, only their presence. Cold cloths. Quiet words and accented English. The kind of care that comes from refusing to give up on someone. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in days. He was alive. His body had survived what medicine could barely touch. The infection hadn't killed him. Healing had begun. The tissue around his skull plate started to close. His bones began the slow process of knitting together. Recovery would take months. Maybe years. The damage was permanent. But Eugene Moran was going to live. Word spread through the hospital. The American who fell 4 miles and survived. The tail gunner who kept firing while falling. The man who should have died again and again but refused to. Even German guards came to look at him. Other prisoners asked about the story. The hospital staff seemed stunned by the fact he wasn't dead. But the hospital wasn't a permanent home. Once he could travel, he would be sent to a long-term POW camp. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again. His arms were still in splints. The metal plate in his skull gave him constant headaches. His ribs hurt with every breath, but he could move. The Germans processed him with cold efficiency. Name. Rank. Serial number. Unit. A photograph taken for records. A thin young man with bandaged arms and eyes that looked far older than 19. His first permanent camp was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, built specifically to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences. Guard towers with machine guns. Wooden barracks that offered little protection against the brutal winter. Thousands of American and British airmen lived there, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. Some had been prisoners for years. Others had arrived only recently. All of them were waiting for the war to end or for their bodies to give up. Inside the wire, prisoners built a strange kind of society. They organized routines. They held classes. They created libraries from donated books. They built hidden radios to listen for BBC broadcasts. They planned escapes that almost never worked. Food was minimal: thin soup, dark bread, sometimes potatoes or turnips. Red Cross packages helped when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable. Most prisoners lost huge amounts of weight. Moran's body continued to heal, but never fully recovered. His arms regained function, though weakness and pain remained. The headaches became less frequent but never disappeared. The nightmares never stopped. And the war wasn't finished with him. In the summer of 1944, the Germans began moving prisoners more often as their situation worsened. Moran was transported across occupied Poland in a cattle car packed with dozens of men. No room to sit. No sanitation. No food for days. Men collapsed against each other, praying for the journey to end. He was moved from one camp to another, then another, shuffled like cargo across a shrinking empire. Then came the worst transport of all. German authorities decided to move hundreds of Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The ship was an aging freighter, never meant to carry human beings in large numbers. Guards forced prisoners into the hold below deck, a dark metal chamber with almost no ventilation, no sanitation, and barely any space to move. Moran descended into the hold with hundreds of others. The hatch closed above them. Darkness swallowed everything. Inside, men couldn't see their own hands. They could only hear coughing, groaning, vomiting. Dysentery spread. The single bucket used as a toilet became useless as the stench turned unbearable. Some men died during the crossing, and their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. The crossing lasted 4 days. When the hatch finally opened, Moran climbed out into gray daylight with eyes that had forgotten how to adjust to light. His clothes were soaked with filth. His body was thinner than ever. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with pain. The survivors were delivered to another camp in Prussia. More wire. More towers. More hunger. More waiting. But by early 1945, the end was coming. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied armies were pushing from the west. German guards grew nervous. Distant artillery could sometimes be heard. Then, on February 6, 1945, everything changed. Soviet troops were approaching the camp. German commanders ordered an immediate evacuation. The prisoners would march west on foot. Nobody was told where they were going or how long it would take. Refusal meant death. The prisoners assembled in freezing temperatures far below zero. Many had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had been starving for months. And now they were ordered to walk across Germany in one of the coldest winters in decades. The column stretched for miles, thousands of Allied airmen moving through snow and ice with guards beside them holding rifles. The rules were simple. Keep moving or be shot. Moran had survived a fall from the sky. He had survived shattered bones, infection, crude surgery, camps, and the Hell's Ship. Now he faced hundreds of miles on foot with a body that still carried the damage of 1943. The march would later become known as the Black March, one of the longest forced marches of Allied prisoners in Europe. For nearly 3 months, men walked through blizzards and freezing rain. They slept in barns filled with animal waste or on open ground. They drank from ditches contaminated with sewage. They ate whatever could be stolen or scavenged. Thousands died from disease, frostbite, exhaustion, and bullets from guards who decided a weak man wasn't worth waiting for. Moran's arms ached in the cold. His ribs still punished every breath. The metal plate in his skull seemed to pull the freezing air straight into his head. His body protested every step. Men collapsed in the snow and never rose again. But Moran kept walking. He had not survived the impossible just to die on a frozen road. He kept moving through February and March. Day after day. 15 to 20 miles at a time. Snow sometimes reaching up to their knees. By April, the sound of Allied artillery grew louder. Liberation was approaching. On April 26, 1945, American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the prisoner column near the Elbe River. The German guards threw down their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. Some didn't even shoot. After so long in captivity, freedom felt unreal. Moran weighed about 93 pounds. He had entered the army around 150. War had stripped away nearly half of him. But he was alive. Medical teams rushed to treat the liberated men. Many were suffering from typhus, pneumonia, frostbite, and starvation. Doctors worked nonstop to stabilize prisoners whose bodies were barely functioning. Moran's case stunned everyone who reviewed it. Shot down near Bremen in November 1943. Aircraft destroyed. Fell from 24,000 feet inside a severed tail section with a destroyed parachute. Survived impact. Captured. Held for 17 months. Survived a forced march of roughly 600 miles. Only 3 Allied airmen were known to survive falls like that without parachutes during the entire war. Moran was one of them. In each case, the wreckage slowed the descent just enough to make survival possible. The Army awarded him 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds to both arms. He received the Air Medal with an oak leaf cluster and other campaign awards. He was honorably discharged in December 1945. The 96th Bomb Group had suffered terrible losses during the war, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, hundreds of men killed or missing. Moran's survival was not just rare. It was almost impossible. Even during the war, his story had spread. Radio operators intercepted German broadcasts describing an American who fell 4 miles and lived. Word reached Wisconsin, where his family waited for months without knowing whether he was alive or dead. When he finally returned home in late 1945, he was only 21 years old, but he looked and carried himself like someone far older. He married Margaret Finley, a local girl who had known him before the war. She saw beyond the scars and the haunted eyes. Together they built a life on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same land where Moran once watched planes fly overhead and dreamed of flight. But those dreams had been replaced by memories he could never fully escape. The roar of engines. The chatter of machine guns. The scream of metal tearing apart at altitude. Moran rarely spoke about what happened. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. The losses were too deep. 8 crewmates had died on Rikki-Tikki. Friends died in camps and on the march. Speaking about it meant reliving it. His body never completely healed. The metal plate caused headaches. For the rest of his life. His arms remained weak and painful in cold weather. His ribs ached when storms approached. He carried the evidence of that November morning until his final breath. But he lived. He raised a family. He worked his farm. He went to church. He watched grandchildren grow up. He outlived most of his fellow prisoners and nearly everyone who had flown with him. In 2007, decades after the war, Wisconsin created a new honor called the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. Eugene Moran became the first recipient. For the first time, his story was officially recognized by his state. That recognition brought attention. Journalists interviewed him. Historians began documenting the details. A teacher and researcher became fascinated with the story and spent years gathering records, interviewing family members, and digging through archives. The result eventually became a book that preserved the full account of the tail gunner who fell from the sky and survived. In 2008, Soldiers Grove honored him by naming a street after him, Eugene Moran Way. The other survivor of the bomber, navigator Jesse Orizon, also returned home. He had escaped from the forward section before the aircraft broke apart, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. His testimony supported Moran's story and helped confirm what happened over Bremen. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014, at the age of 89. More than 70 years had passed since the day flak and fighters destroyed his bomber and sent him falling from 24,000 feet over enemy territory. 70 years since he kept firing while the world spun around him. 70 years since doctors with almost nothing managed to keep him alive. His life was often described by a simple idea: he would rather wear out than rust out. A fitting philosophy for someone who refused to surrender, to the enemy, to injuries, to captivity, or to the slow damage war leaves behind. The tail gunner position on a B-17 was the loneliest place on the aircraft. Separated from the crew. A favorite target for enemy fighters. The last man to know if the bomber was dying. Eugene Moran sat there on November 29, 1943. And when his aircraft broke apart around him, he didn't curl up and wait for death. He kept firing all the way down. If this story meant something to you, support WW2 Impact by hitting like. Every single like helps YouTube share these real stories with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more forgotten history and unbelievable survival stories from World War II. And comment below where you're watching from: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else. Our community is global, and you're not just watching, you're helping keep these memories alive. Thank you for being here, and thank you for making sure Eugene Moran's story is never forgotten.